Our Bible word is Mark 1 verse 22. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. So let's first look at the historical context of the Gospel of Mark. And here, unfortunately, the evidence is not so conclusive. It's a bit confusing. Early church tradition, according to this one early church figure called Papias, he said that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark based on the teaching of Peter while Peter was in Rome. And this is mentioned by Eusebius. Eusebius was a church historian, and he quoted this writing of Papias. And Papias, he was a bishop of Hierapolis in Asia Minor until about 130 AD. And he said he got this information from a figure called John the Elder. Now, Papias describes that Mark was Peter's interpreter or his translator. So, Peter, he, as best he could remember, he gave this, or remembered these teachings, and he spoke it in Aramaic, his home language, or his mother tongue, and then Mark translated it into Greek. And if this is so, then this would have happened in Rome sometime maybe in the 50s or 60s. Some scholars, though, question this because they say that if you read Mark, it's more closely associated with Paul or the theology of Paul. Because remember, Peter and Paul, they had this confrontation in Antioch about table fellowship with Gentiles. Peter withdrew from table fellowship with Gentiles, and Mark's gospel actually says that Jesus declared all foods clean. So that's more in line with Paul's theology and what we encounter in Paul's letters. Also, what we encounter is that Mark's gospel has a very strong emphasis on the cross or the crucifixion of Jesus, which is also very close to the theology of Paul. Now, if you read the New Testament, there is a Mark that's variously associated with either Peter or Paul. Let's first look at Paul. Well, John Mark is first mentioned in Acts, and there he was the son of a certain Mary, and this Mary had a house church in Jerusalem. And this was a place also that Peter went to. We can read that in Acts 12 verse 12. But this John Mark also accompanied his cousin Barnabas and Paul on their first missionary journey. And we can read that there in Acts 12 and 13. And Paul also mentions a Mark in his epistles. We find that in Colossians 4 verses 10 and also in Philemon 24. And these epistles were perhaps written while Paul was in prison in Rome in 60 to 62 AD. A Mark, however, is also associated with Peter, and that we read about in 1 Peter 5 verses 13, where Peter sends greetings from my son Mark. So we have here that perhaps this comes from Rome, because Paul was in Rome from 60 to 62 AD. Peter also came to Rome at a stage. So maybe this refers to this John Mark as we encountered in Acts also, but we cannot be sure that this is the same Mark that is referred to in 1 Peter and also by Papias. Remember what I said? Papias said that Mark was Peter's translator or interpreter in Rome. Other scholars also question that this could really come from Peter, because the emphasis of the gospel was a lot on Galilee. This is where Jesus will appear to his disciples. And also, we also find something in Mark 13, verses 14, where the author writes there, So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So that piece, let the reader understand, that indicates that those reading or receiving this gospel are not in Rome. They are somewhere in Judea or Galilee. And it's relevant to the time of the war, the Great Revolt that dates between 66 to 70 AD. Because it will be applicable to these people as warning. Flee to the mountains. Because this war is happening, the Romans are coming, they're on their way to and they're also going to destroy the temple, which they eventually did in 70 AD. So it also might be that it was written in Rome because some Latin terms also appear in the gospel. For example, if you go to Mark 12 verses 42, where the author writes of the widows too, lepta, and those are Greek coins. And he says they are the equivalent to a quadrans, which is a Roman coin. This and many other instances in the gospel also may suggest that yes, this was written in Rome. But some scholars question it. So we have two options here. Either this gospel, like Papias says, was written by Mark based on the teaching of Peter in Rome, and perhaps this happened in the 50s and 60s. Or alternatively, maybe this gospel was written in Galilee. Perhaps in the year sometime between the year 66 to 70 AD. And scholars also refer to it as a wartime gospel because it's relevant to the wartime, that great revolt that happened around this period. So we cannot be sure exactly when the gospel was written. Anyway, the gospel, it's the portrayal of Jesus we encounter in the Gospels. Yeah, Jesus is the most down-to-earth, so to speak, of all the portrayals we encounter in the Gospels. Because he exhibits a whole wide range of emotions like compassion or anger or grief and amazement. He also experiences great anxiety when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus also has limited knowledge. For example, there also in chapter 13, he says, we do not know when the Son of Man will come. Even the Son, in other words, the Son of God himself doesn't know when it will happen. Even so, Jesus is powerful in this gospel. Jesus comes to Galilee like a hurricane, not a destructive force, but he is a force, he's a powerful presence. Because he comes there, he teaches, he heals, he performs exorcisms, etc. If we go to the beginning of the gospel, if you look at his teaching, people are astonished at what he says. If we go to verse 22, and they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. So Jesus is this amazing teacher. And also he performs all these miracles, these exorcisms. He walks on water. He multiplies loaves and fishes. He's this incredible force that moves through Galilee. And people are amazed and awestruck by him. And often people ask, who is this? They cannot believe who this is, the power. And of course, for the gospel, it's clear Jesus is the mighty Messiah and the Son of God. He's the one that is here to establish God's kingdom amongst God's people. And also accompanying this is what is known as the Messianic Secret. Because quite often Jesus, he performs an exorcism and then he instructs the demons, don't tell anybody that this has happened. Also, when Peter acknowledges Jesus, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, Jesus tells him, don't tell anybody. So there's this motif of secrecy also running throughout the entire gospel. It it's as if it hides Jesus' identity as the Messiah. And perhaps it has to do with Jesus being a different kind of Messiah. He's not the usual Messiah that people expected. He would come and fight against the Romans. As the gospel narrative unfolds, it becomes clear Jesus as a Messiah, he must suffer. He must die. He must be tortured to death on the cross. And that went entirely against the understanding of the time of what the Messiah would be. Jesus is this mighty force, this mighty presence. He rushes through Galilee. He amazes people. They ask, who is this? This is incredible. We haven't seen something like this before. And of course, Jesus was this powerful human being. He's the Son of God who brings or inaugurates God's kingdom on the earth. If we focus now on our textual unit, this is where Jesus begins to teach with authority in Galilee. Before this, there was John the Baptist. He announced the way for Jesus. Then Jesus went into the wilderness, and then he entered Galilee. He called his first disciples, and now they come to Capernaum. And Capernaum, if you look on screen, this is remains of a synagogue of Capernaum. But this one was built after the time of Jesus. But archaeologists say beneath this synagogue there are foundation stones of an earlier synagogue that dated to the time of Jesus in the 1st century. But Jesus now with his first disciples, he comes to the synagogue in Capernaum, and now he's teaching for Markus' launch, so to speak. And it's something new, it's something radical, it's something that people haven't seen before. So let's go to verse 21. And our textual unit is from verse 21 to verse 28. It's a new teaching with authority. So if you go to verse 21, it says, Then they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and taught. So Capernaum was also a kind of base of operations for Jesus in Galilee. That's where he lived for most of the time. But of course, he also moved around in Galilee. And then we come to our Bible word. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. So the scribes, they were people obviously who could write and read. They often made copies of letters, wrote letters for people, but they could also read the law and interpret the law. Probably most of them were priests. So they would have been the teachers of the people. But here it says Jesus teaches as one with authority, not as a scribe. Something new is here. They can feel it, they can sense it, they can hear it. And also interesting to note that in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is often referred to as a teacher. Or they call him teacher. But there's not much teaching material in the Gospel of Mark. That we find more like in Luke and in Matthew, and also Jesus' discourses in the Gospel of John. But he's addressed as a teacher, and he's recognized as a powerful teacher. And this authority of Jesus to teach is also complemented by his authority to heal. If you read there in next verse, now there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit. And so he also cries out there, Jesus, leave us alone. So there are probably a few of these evil spirits according to the author in this man. And look how this spirit also addresses Jesus. He says, let us alone. What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. So this spirit recognizes Jesus is the Holy One of God. And coupled with this also is something in Mark known as the Messianic Secret, because Jesus performs miracles and he tells those people, don't tell anybody. It's as if it's kept a secret or it's kept hidden that Jesus is the Messiah. That's for people, for human beings. But demons and spirits, etc., they know who Jesus is. Like it says here, I recognize you. I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And this is a typical feature we find throughout the Gospel, is how Jesus is addressed. The demons know who Jesus is. So, and they address Jesus differently to human beings. If we look now on screen on the left-hand column, there's the humans. They call Jesus Lord, Teacher, Son of David, Master, etc. But the demons, they call Jesus the Holy One of God, the Son of God, the Son of the Most High God. So the demons know who Jesus is and they recognize him. This is the Son of God. This is the Messiah. For people as such, there's still a secret. It's not revealed yet who Jesus is. And for this demon to call Jesus and to recognize him, it was also a defensive strategy. It was so believed at this time that if you know the name of this power authority, that person will not have power over you. But yeah, it does not work. Jesus rebukes the spirit and he says, come out of him. And so this man was healed. And it says there, he convulsed and he cried out with a loud voice, and the spirit came out of him. And now the people are amazed. If you go to verse 27, then they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, what is this? What new doctrine is this? For with authority he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. Normally at this time, there were magicians and exorcists that were operating, and they would use incantations and spells, and they would use long lists of words to use to get the demon or spirit or out of somebody. But Jesus does not use that. He simply speaks a word, and it happens. Like it says there in verse 25, be quiet and come out of him. So Jesus has absolute authority. And of course the people are astonished. They're saying there, what is this? They haven't seen this before. There's something new here. Jesus with authority is here to teach and to heal. And of course here Jesus' conflict with evil spirits, it begins and it develops throughout the gospel. And of course Jesus defeats evil spirits. Jesus came to defeat evil, death and sin. That was his mission. And yet for the Gospel of Mark, this is where it started. So these people obviously are astonished at his authority, at his power. And the fame of Jesus spreads throughout all of Galilee. At this time, there was also what social scientists will call the gossip network. Because at this time, most people, they could not read or write. So whatever news they heard, they heard, or they received, they heard. They could not read it. So through the gossip network, in other words, people will gossip about Jesus. And they say, did you hear about this guy Jesus, what he did? He did this and this and this. And so it will spread from village to village in Galilee and from town to town. Through the gossip network, the fame of Jesus will spread by people sharing the news of this authority and this power of Jesus, his teaching, and also his ability to heal, that he exorcised this demon from this man in the synagogue in Capernaum.